Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about a new film on HBO Max, The Witches. Before we begin, let me know in the comments if you were looking forward to this or what your thoughts are if you've seen it already, and make sure to give this a thumbs up if you like these reviews. It helps me out immensely if you do that. Also, if you're new here and you like movies, whether it be blockbusters, hidden gems, or everything in between, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases and some classics. But now, let's jump right into it. This stars Jahzir Kadeem Bruno as Charlie, a young orphan who stays with his grandmother, played by Octavia Spencer, in a hotel in 1960s Alabama. There, he discovers a coven of witches led by the Grand High Witch, played by Anne Hathaway, and when they discover him and turn him into a mouse, he and his grandmother team up with two other children also turned into mice, so they can stop the witches in their tracks. This is the second adaptation of the children's book of the same name by Roald Dahl. I haven't read it, and I unfortunately wasn't able to check out the original 1990 film before watching this, but I wanted to as I know it has a pretty big following. At some point I'll rectify that. This dropped on HBO Max today after a surprise announcement earlier in the month. Originally it was meant for a theatrical release earlier in the year, but then it got pulled from the schedule due to the pandemic. I thought we weren't going to get it until next year, but then at the beginning of the month, it was announced we were going to get it much earlier than expected. And it's directed by Robert Zemeckis, who co-wrote this along with Kenya Barris, who also wrote the Coming to America sequel, as well as Guillermo del Toro, and both Zemeckis and del Toro serve as producers alongside Alfonso Cuarón. So there are some big names attached to this one, with a pretty solid cast that also includes Stanley Tucci, Kristen Chenoweth, and Chris Rock narrating as the older Charlie. And the cast did a fine job. The performances are by far the movie's strongest element, mainly Anne Hathaway and Octavia Spencer. Hathaway goes very over the top here, probably the most that I've ever seen from her. She uses a thick accent that didn't quite land all the time for me, but she has very theatrical mannerisms and goes big with her delivery. She'll suddenly shift from sounding very affluent and put together to then screaming and shouting, and it provides some pretty good laughs. Octavia Spencer, meanwhile, brings out the film's sweeter side. She's very charming and very sharp. She's comforting towards her grandson, who recently lost his parents, and her delivery comes across as very sincere. And that's something that's always been consistent about Spencer. No matter how the movie itself is, she always gives a very committed performance that ends up bringing the most amount of emotion to the film, and that's once again the case here. Jahzir Kadeem Bruno is good as well. His character is a pretty standard, noble, good-natured protagonist, similar to the characters in Dahl's other stories, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, and Matilda. He's not exactly very complex. Outside of being turned into a mouse, there are only so many risks taken with this character, but he was fine. As were Kristen Chenoweth and Cody Leigh Eastick, who play the other two children turned into mice. Again, only so much done with them. Though with Eastick's character, there are numerous jokes made about his weight, and I was trying to see if this was intentionally a thing Dahl does in his stories for a reason, though I didn't find anything. But between this, Matilda, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and it could be in other stories, I'm not sure, but he seems to have a thing about incorporating an overweight kid character with his weight being the butt of many jokes, or at least getting one joke in there. There was Augustus Gloop in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and there was the kid who loved chocolate cake in Matilda. Again, not sure if this is intentional, but just an interesting observation I noticed. Stanley Tucci was also fine, though he wasn't exactly given much to do. He's the hotel manager, and his main shtick just seemed to be periodically checking in on the witches. He doesn't add too much to the story, but he had a few funny moments. His performance was fine for what it was. Same goes for Chris Rock's narration. He doesn't say anything particularly memorable, outside of giving us backstory where it's needed, and they don't overuse his narration, but his delivery was solid. He's a nice familiar voice to hear every so often, though again, it's not like he had much to offer. I do appreciate Zemeckis' direction and the fact that he really tries capturing the fantastical tone of the story. I got the sense he was trying to get down the vibe of some of the 90s Roald Dahl movies like Matilda and James and the Giant Peach, because he tries giving these scenes these very grandiose, theatrical sort of feel. And I also appreciated things like the score and its heavy use of 60s and 70s R&B to give it this uplifting tone. And the costume designs were also very colorful and vibrant. The CGI, however, I'd say is pretty weak. I'm sure if this was 20 years ago when it wasn't being used as often, this might have been something that impresses us, but this looks very obviously fake. Between the mice, the action some of the witches take, and some of the animals they turn other people into. Like, I know not every movie with CGI is going to be this top of the line stuff, but this looks barely believable. It's very obviously a CGI mouse talking to Octavia Spencer, and the movements of some of the witches look very noticeably off. And even though it's a fantasy movie, you still want the effects to look as real as possible, so you stay in the moment. But anytime there was a scene that relied on effects, it felt like I was clearly watching something fake. And just given how far CGI's come, I was expecting much better. Maybe it looked this way because the film's targeted for younger audiences, and maybe they didn't want to frighten them too much. To my understanding, the original film, and I imagine the book, gets much darker. I honestly don't know how much that's true, correct me if I'm wrong there, but this does look very sanitized and geared heavily towards kids. And I think the story and cheesy visuals will be enough to entertain them, but that also leads to my biggest criticism, which is if you're out of that target audience, this might be kind of an uneven experience for you. The problem is this film plays things a bit too safe. I heard there are elements from the original story that were left out of this, and I'm not gonna knock the movie solely based on that, but it seems that the way it'll go from point A to point B, it just feels a little too neat, and it didn't leave room for much nuance. Things are resolved a little too easily in some areas. The tension only goes so high, and the stakes are only raised by so much. We don't feel the struggle these main characters have to go through. There's one scene where they're all trying to come up with a plan to take on the witches, and Charlie just spits out this really elaborate plan almost instantly, like off the top of his head. And Octavia Spencer goes to him, "Did you come up with that on your own just now?" And he goes, "Yeah." It barely gives us a moment of these characters struggling to overcome their obstacles. They always seem to know what to do and when to do it. Plus, they're also very quick to accept certain situations that should feel a lot worse than they are, like the kids just accepting their mice. At times it felt like they were barely even bothered by it. And because of moments like that, it loses some of the tension it should have had. Plus, I think it could have just been a tad shorter, as it kind of dragged at times, or if they were gonna keep that hour and 40-minute runtime, they could have reworked some of the story elements. Like, there's some background with Octavia Spencer that gets touched upon in the beginning and only gets sporadically revisited throughout the movie. And I felt it really didn't add much emotional impact to anything happening later on. While, as I said, Spencer herself was great, it would have added so much more to her character. So while there was emotion here, it just wasn't as engaging as I was hoping it to be. This makes for some decent family entertainment. It has a nice feel to it, capturing the tone of the 90s Roald Dahl movies. It has a heart, plus some great performances from Anne Hathaway and Octavia Spencer. And there are enough fun gags and colorful visuals that younger audiences will certainly appreciate it. That being said, it's really nothing special. The story plays things a bit too safe and resolves conflicts too neatly. Plus, it has some really bad CGI that ends up taking you out of the moment multiple times, and makes for an uneven experience. There's enough for a casual, one-time watch, but it's nothing memorable, and it's nothing I'd revisit. The Witches gets a 6 out of 10. So let me know, have you seen The Witches, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you like the performances? Have you seen the original movie? And if so, how does it compare to this? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll catch you next time.